Caleb Thorne was not running from the police, nor from physical imprisonment, but from the lurking shadows of unsettled contracts. For the past 18 months, his life had been a continuous string of damp flop houses, dog-eared history books, and the relentless fear that the shadow broker, who had loaned him a crippling sum for a failed excavation project, would finally track him down. Caleb, once a promising scholar with a thesis on the imperial decay of power across eras, was now a ragged coward with a scuffed leather satchel and a worthless PhD. When he saw the faded recruitment ad on a rare job board website, Hallowed Oath Academy, seeking substitute history/philosophy lecturer. Prerequisite: no fear of death, Caleb offered a bitter, hollow laugh. This was his last chance. If the academy was hell, at least he would die with slightly more significance than being foreclosed upon in a dark alley. The final bus dropped him on a muddy road outside the last settlement of the remote town, where the fog was so thick and cold it seemed to freeze sound itself. Further on, perched atop a jagged slate hill, rose the Hallowed Oath Fortress. It was not architecture, it was a scar on the landscape. The fortress was a colossal Gothic structure, built from black basalt and marble stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. As Caleb approached, he had to pass through the fossil gate. The twin gates were constructed from enormous vertebral segments, arranged and fused into a soaring archway. At the apex, skulls, perhaps of an extinct reptile or monster, seemed to gaze down at Caleb with hollow eyes. Caleb took a deep breath. The air here was not only cold, but smelled of sulfur and ozone, as if an eternal electromagnetic storm hung over the region. He stepped through the gate, feeling as though 1,000 invisible eyes were scrutinizing his history doctorate. Inside, the academy was a labyrinth of decaying grandeur. Black marble floors reflected the faint light from the sickly blue torches mounted on the walls. Caleb's footsteps echoed in the vast hall, but they were joined by other noises. The low murmur of wind through cracks in the stone, and faint crackling sounds that he swore were dark magic being tempered in sealed chambers. This was not a building. It was a colossal cage for confined spirits, and Caleb was an uninvited guest. He was led to the office of the Academy's master, Magnus Lycaeus. Magnus' chamber was at the summit of the West Tower, where the wind whistled through the dreary stained glass windows. The room was so frigid Caleb's breath plumed into smoke. Magnus Lycaeus sat behind a desk crafted from polished obsidian. He was not a normal man. His imposing height, slicked-back black hair, and perfectly tailored suit only amplified his fearsome authority. But his eyes were the most terrifying feature. They were a brilliant amber, rimmed by an unmistakable scarlet ring of vampiric lineage, and the pupils of a hunting wolf. "Thorne," Magnus said, his voice deep and cold as cooled lava. He did not invite Caleb to sit. "Master Lycaeus, I am here to apply for the position of ancient history lecturer." Caleb tried to project confidence, but his voice shook uncontrollably. Magnus picked up a copy of Caleb's curriculum vitae, the paper creased and bearing a faint coffee stain. He did not read it. He simply inhaled deeply, as if scenting the information rather than reading it. "Dr. Thorne," Magnus murmured, "we know of you. We know you were rejected from the Interdisciplinary Research Foundation. We know you owe the shadow broker of 7 Shades over 1 million units. We know you are desperate enough to sign a contract with anyone, provided that contract removes you from their territory." Caleb's throat tightened, cold sweat prickling his skin. Every lie, every concealment, had been seen through by Magnus. "Then why are you still considering me?" Caleb stammered. Magnus smirked, revealing one canine tooth slightly longer than usual. "Because you are perfect, Thorne. You are expendable, familyless, relationship-free, and most importantly, you possess a scholar's brain. My students, the Inheritors, require a steady source of knowledge to feed their minds, but they also require a weak target upon which to vent their aggression. You are the ideal teaching aid." He tossed the CV back onto the desk. "You are hired. Your salary will be paid directly into an account protected from any debt collection, as long as you remain alive. Your room is on the 5th basement level. Your class, Class A, begins at the first dawn. Magnus did not wait for a reply. He waved his hand, signaling Caleb to leave. Caleb left the office, a blend of sheer terror and peculiar elation washing over him. He had a job, and he was safe from his debtors. He had sold his soul, but that soul had been cheap to begin with. Before he could find the stairs down to the basement, he was intercepted in the Hall of Scrutiny. There, he met his first 2 colleagues. Professor Serafina stood beside a gleaming metal dissection table. She was either a witch or a corrupted scientist, with platinum hair pinned high and a magnifying loupe attached to her left eye. Her gaze was clinical and utterly devoid of emotion. Serafina was engrossed in dissecting a crimson, pulsating, fibrous object that looked exactly like a human heart, but larger and emitting faint, distressed whimpers. "Oh, the substitute lecturer has arrived," Serafina noted without looking up. "Do you know the weight of the soul, Thorne? I'm attempting to quantify it. I've pulverized the tissues and I've discovered nothing. Utterly empty." She brought the scalpel down, and the fibrous heart sprayed a stream of thick purple liquid. Caleb gagged, taking a step back. "Professor, I am an ancient history specialist." "Indeed, the history of failures. Do not contaminate my research area," Serafina replied, returning completely to her gruesome work. Utterly disoriented, Caleb stumbled into a massive figure leaning against the stone wall nearby. This was Professor Fenris. Fenris was a purebred werewolf, standing over 8 feet tall, covered in coarse gray fur like steel wool. He wore a tattered leather coat, and his glowing amber eyes stared at Caleb with near animalistic indifference. "You're Thorne," Fenris growled, his voice guttural and rough. "Yes, Professor." Fenris tilted his head, revealing a large scar running across the bridge of his nose. He reached out a hand, fingers tipped with sharp black claws, and grasped Caleb's shoulder, squeezing agonizingly hard. "Listen here, you frail scholar," Fenris said, almost whispering, yet the words carried the weight of boulders. "I don't care about your degree or your fears. There is only one rule here. The first, and the only, rule for you to survive long enough to cash a paycheck." Fenris pulled Caleb close, the stench of damp earth and wolf rank in the air. "Always protect the young masters at all costs." Fenris emphasized every syllable. "Those children, the Inheritors, they are the oldest surviving bloodline. If any harm comes to them under your watch, Master Lycaos won't need the Shadow Broker to deal with you. He'll flay the skin from your bones himself." Fenris released Caleb, leaving a bruise blooming beneath his shirt. Caleb Thorne, substitute lecturer of ancient history, swallowed hard. He realized he hadn't just stepped into a school, he had stepped into a nest of monsters, where he was considered live bait. He found his small, dark room on the 5th basement level, right next to a bone shard storage vault. He took off his crumpled tie and prepared for his first class, knowing that every moment in this school was a fight for survival. Caleb Thorne's first classroom was located in the northern wing of the academy, a vast vaulted chamber with stained glass windows depicting ancient sacrificial rites instead of saints. The air was thick with the scent of old sulfur and marble dust. The session began at 3 in the morning, following the academy's inexplicable schedule, and Caleb had consumed 2 cups of coffee brewed from a shimmering black bean provided by Professor Serafina, which kept his mind painfully alert. His students, the inheritors of supernatural bloodlines, were unlike any Caleb had ever taught. They did not sit, they presided. Today, we begin with the subject of the history of power and ancient arcane theocracy. Caleb attempted, striving for his firmest academic tone, but the tremor inside him warped the sound. "Consider the civilizations that sought to control." He paused. No one was taking notes. No one was even looking at him. In the front row, a girl named Rosalia, or Thorn Girl, sat coiled like a bramble bush. Tiny, dark green thorns sprouted from her hair, her clothing, and even the rims of her eyes. Whenever she exhaled, a plume of humid smoke lingered in the air. She stared at him with chronic boredom, as if Caleb's very existence were a personal insult to her magical lineage. Beside her was Caius, Tempest Boy. Caius was never still. The air around him was perpetually charged. His hair stood up faintly, and the tiny hairs on his hands constantly emitted dry, crackling sounds. Every time he shifted, a fine layer of marble dust on the desktop moved in a non-existent breeze. Caius was idly filing down an unshed canine tooth with his thumbnail, his expression one of pure disdain. Caleb sighed, realizing his Socratic method would fail. Thorn girl, Rosalia. If power were a tangible object, how much do you believe it would weigh? Rosalia did not reply. Instead, a sharp barb shot out from her sleeve, pinning the exact page Caleb was holding to the lectern. An interesting question, Professor, Caius said in a cold voice that resonated like an impending thunderclap. I believe it weighs the same as the soul of a fugitive seeking salvation, a very light weight indeed. Caleb felt a hot flush run down his spine. They knew. Somehow, these monster children had seen past his academic facade to his desperation and his secret. An intriguing hypothesis, Caleb countered, attempting to maintain calm. But true power is not what you possess, but what you serve. Much like this academy. The moment he uttered the word academy, the entire room shuddered. It was not a natural tremor. It was more like a growl emanating from the very backbone of the earth, a sound of pure, painful magic. The candles in the room extinguished, and the only light remaining came from cracks that began to race across the floor. The marble floor, as hard as fossilized bone, began to fissure uncannily. The cracks did not run straight, but twisted into bizarre symbols, forming a gate. From beneath the fissure, something welled up. The black ichor. It was a thick, pitch-black, highly viscous fluid that smelled of unfiltered magical waste, the pure chaos of decay and energy. It smoked, and wherever it touched the floor, the marble turned to cinder. The ichor erupted like a burst artery, engulfing the base of the lectern and quickly spreading beneath the students' feet. For the first time, Caleb saw panic in the children's eyes. Even Caius trembled, small bolts of lightning running uncontrollably down his arms. And then, the parasitic beast emerged. It did not crawl out, it grew. From a boiling pool of black ichor, a massive, asymmetrical body rose. It was shaped like a twisted, colossal spider, with no fixed face, just a mass of stretched, pallid gray flesh. The most horrific part was its limbs. Not legs, but bony, sharp tentacles, long as scimitars, sprouted from its back. They were grayish-white, like fragments of spinal columns forged into weapons. The parasitic beast ignored Caleb. Its eyes, or the things that functioned as eyes, were entirely focused on the children. It was a predator of sorcery, drawn by the ancient blood flowing in the Inheritors. Run! Caleb yelled, finally shaking off his paralysis. He staggered back, tripping over an old chair. But the children were not fast enough. The speed of the parasitic beast was incredible. Its bony tentacles lashed out like whips. They coiled around Rosalia. Her thorns tried to pierce the tendrils, but failed. The bone was too solid. They constricted Caius, snuffing out his last electrical sparks. A series of muffled screams erupted as one by one. The children were pulled off the floor. They hung suspended in the air, tightly squeezed by the beast's tentacles. The parasitic beast began to retreat, dragging its prey toward the widening fissure. Caleb saw Rosalia. The look in her eyes was no longer contempt, but silent horror. She stared at him, pleading for help. With a monstrous, magical growl, the parasitic beast spun around, its massive body blocking the last of the light. It plunged into the pit, not falling, but diving into the surging ichor. The floor slammed shut instantly, but not completely. A small, deep crack remained, from which rose the smell of ozone and rotting magic. Only Caleb Thorne remained. He lay on the scorched marble floor, his breath ragged. His syllabus was stained with black ichor, the chairs were overturned, and the room was now terribly empty. Caleb had come here seeking salvation, but he had just watched the most powerful creatures in the academy swallowed by a monster from beneath. He was a mortal man in the ruins, a professor without students. And then he heard footsteps. The classroom door swung open, and the tall, cold figure of Headmaster Magnus Lycaeus appeared, his wolf vampire eyes sweeping over the chaos. He showed no concern for the children, only extreme fury directed at the crack in the floor. An unforgivable lapse, Magnus snarled, his voice echoing through the room. Professor Thorne, you let them enter the abyss. Magnus Lycaeus strode in, his black robes gliding over the dust and ashes. He stopped before Caleb, who struggled to stand. They are inheritors. If they are absorbed by unfiltered magic, our balance of power will crumble. Do you understand what that means? Magnus didn't wait for an answer. It means the Blood Vow Academy will be disgraced, and that is not permitted. He did not ask if Caleb was hurt, nor did he ask about the Parasitic Beast. His sole concern was power and reputation. I am not a warrior. I am a scholar, Caleb stammered, the horror still lodged in his throat. You were warned about rule number 1, Thorne, Magnus said, his red eyes blazing in the dim light. You must protect the young masters at all costs. And this is your one chance to redeem your incompetence. You will descend and bring them back. Descend? It is subterranean, in the flow of black ichor. Magnus ignored his protest. He gestured, and from a shadowed corner of the room, a heavy, silent figure stepped forward. It was Pastor Silas, Silas the Ghoul. Silas was a reanimated corpse, about a head taller than Caleb. His skin was desiccated, the grayish-green color of damp earth and decay. He wore tattered priestly robes, and a pungent odor of mildew and ancient regret emanated from his body. Though he was not alive, Caleb felt a deep surge of sorrowful energy radiating from Silas. Silas will be your companion, Magnus commanded. He is the guide to the lower levels and an expert on parasitic entities. He does not speak, but he knows the solitary confinement vaults better than anyone. Silas turned his head toward Caleb. His movement was slow, creaking like an old wooden door. His sunken, empty eyes looked straight at Caleb, not with judgment, but with a terrifying comprehension of imminent death. Caleb had no choice. Stuck between the enraged headmaster Lycaeus and the death awaiting him in the abyss, he preferred to go with the ghoul. The solitary confinement vaults are a labyrinth designed to hold captive magical entities confined over centuries, Magnus explained, his voice now returning to its cold indifference. It is rife with arcane traps and guardian monsters. Your goal is to trace the parasitic beast, bring the children to the surface, and not die. If you fail, I will personally ensure your demise serves as a lesson to the entire academy. Silas extended a bony hand, a gesture slow but clear. It was an invitation. Caleb looked down at his only weapons, academic intellect and the recklessness of a man who had nothing left to lose. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the familiar tin box. He took out a small green mint, a tic-tac, placing it on his tongue. The sharp coolness was the only anchor keeping him tethered to reality. All right, Pastor, Caleb said, taking a deep breath of the moldy air. Lead the way. We're going to save the children. Silas nodded, a movement that made his neck bones crackle. The ghoul turned and began walking toward the fissure. Caleb followed. Together, they descended into the narrow hole. The moment Caleb set foot on the ground tainted by the black ichor, he felt a horrific coldness seep into his very bones, welcoming him into a world of shadow and decomposition. They were entering the solitary confinement vaults, a place without light, only magic, desperation, and a waiting monster. The solitary confinement vaults were a network of spiraling stone corridors built thousands of years ago, deeper than any mortal construction. The air was damp, heavy, and filled with invisible whispers. Although there were no lamps, the stone was carved with faint glowing images depicting sacrificial rites and the worship of shadow. Caleb quickly realized Silas's value. Silas was not just a guide. He was an arcane trap detector. As they passed through one corridor, Silas stopped abruptly, pointing to an ancient symbol on the wall. Just then, a scythe of black energy swept through the space where Caleb intended to step. Without Silas, he would have been cleaved in two. "Thank you," Caleb whispered. Silas only responded with a deep, mournful moan, as if saving Caleb's life were a burden. The deeper they traveled, the more perilous the journey became. They navigated a series of trapdoors opening directly into a pool of soul acid and a gate guarded by animated stone statues. On the third vault level, they encountered a living obstacle, a mutated raven. It was the size of a wolf, with slick black plumage and bulbous yellow eyes. It blocked the passageway, its sharp claws clinging to the stone, emitting raspy, screeching calls. The raven was no ordinary creature. It was magically crafted, tasked with warning and occasionally devouring intruders. Silas immediately prepared for combat, his moans becoming more alert. "Wait," Caleb said. He knew he couldn't defeat this creature, and if Silas engaged in physical combat, they would alert the Parasitic Beast. Caleb recalled a trick from a forgotten history book about communicating with ancient guardian entities. "What do you want, Watcher Raven? We need information." The mutated raven tilted its necklace head, its yellow gaze sweeping over him arrogantly. Caleb took out the tin of mints. "Have you ever tasted anything that was fresh? Not fresh blood, but absolute purity." He tossed a mint. The raven reacted with astonishing speed, catching the candy neatly between its sharp beak. It chewed suspiciously. After a moment of astonishment, a dry, satisfied croak sounded. The raven demanded more. Caleb knew this was the only kind of bribe it had never received. After bribing the raven with half a tin of mints, Caleb received the information he needed. The raven directed them by tapping its beak sharply against a stone wall. It indicated door number 3, an opening completely obscured by layers of magical grime. That's where the concentration of black ichor is thickest. Where the smell of fresh blood is strongest. Caleb translated the Watcher Raven's message. Silas nodded, this time quicker. Their purpose was clear. They approached door number 3. It had no handle. It was sealed by a grim magical sigil, a binding charm of sacrifice. Caleb and Silas combined their strength to push the door open. As the door gave way, the acrid scent of blood and decaying magic assaulted their noses, so strong that Caleb nearly collapsed. They stepped into a circular room, towering and dark, the hidden sacrificial chamber. In the center of the room was a large stone altar carved with ancient runes, where the Inheritors lay. All of Caleb's students were bound. Rosalia, Caius, and the other monster children were motionless, held fast by the bony sinews of the Parasitic Beast. They were not dead, but the magical energy was slowly being drained from their bodies. And there, presiding next to the altar, was the Parasitic Beast. The monster had changed. It had absorbed enough ichor to grow. Its body was now blacker and wetter. Its entire surface was covered in sharp spikes. The most horrifying detail, a repulsive, circular maw full of fangs, was not on its head, but wide open on its enormous palm. It was preparing to use that mouth to suck the last vestiges of life force from the students. "We have to act now," Caleb whispered. He knew this was a completely mismatched fight. The confrontation erupted. Caleb had no magic, no strength, but he had the recklessness of a cornered man. He found a large, broken skull fragment on the floor, likely a relic of an old ritual. "Hey, you subterranean bloated thing," Caleb yelled, his voice echoing in the sacrificial chamber. "You made a mistake. These children's magic is too crude for you." The Parasitic Beast slowly turned toward him. The mouth on its palm closed shut from the children, focusing on the noise. It growled, a resonant sound that could be felt in the chest. Caleb threw the skull fragment with all his might. It merely struck the monster's shoulder and fell. The action caused no damage, but it was enough to distract the beast. The creature moved swiftly. A bony tentacle lunged toward Caleb with terrifying speed. Caleb dodged, but the force of the whip knocked him back, sending him crashing into the stone wall. He was completely overwhelmed. The Parasitic Beast was not a creature to fight. It was a natural event of darkness. It raised the tentacle, preparing to impale Caleb. And then, Pastor Silas acted. Silas had been observing. He showed no anger or panic, only a sad determination. With a rare, agonizing groan, a sound containing the regret of centuries spent in undeath, Silas used his rotting hand to snap off a piece of his own decaying rib bone. That rib fragment, coated in necrotic poison and necromantic magic, was wielded like a dagger. Just as the parasitic beast's tentacle was about to reach Caleb, Silas hurtled forward with unexpected speed. He plunged the contaminated rib bone straight into the creature's heart, or whatever central organ the monster used. The parasitic beast shrieked. Its scream was not sound, but a disruption of space, cracking the stone and making the air burn. But Silas didn't stop. In a movement both desperate and astonishingly noble, the undead pastor leaped straight into the beast's wide-open handmaw. Silas's necrotic decay and ghoul magic began to spread inside the creature's stomach. The parasitic beast convulsed violently, paralyzed by the unholy waste it had ingested. The pain caused it to drop the children. Caleb, dazed from the impact, quickly crawled forward. He used the broken bone shard to sever the bony sinews that bound the children. "Hurry, we have to go now." The students, though drained, were obedient. Caius and Rosalia, with their remaining strength, helped the weaker children. They rushed out of the sacrificial chamber, leaving Pastor Silas inside, who was slowly but surely dissolving, neutralizing the parasitic beast from within. They returned to the surface just minutes later. Magnus Lycaeus was waiting. He looked at the children, then at Caleb, who was covered in blood and grime. "Remarkable, Professor Thorne. You have saved the Academy's reputation," Magnus said, though there was no warmth, only cold approval. "Where is Pastor Silas?" "He sacrificed himself to hold it back," Caleb said. Magnus merely shrugged. He will regenerate. Eventually. He has been in this academy longer than these walls." True to prediction, just minutes later, a scraping sound came from the pit. Pastor Silas emerged, slowly, his body still decomposing but largely reformed. He even held a massive fragment of the parasitic beast's tentacle in his hand, casually gnawing on it. The children were safe. They turned to look at Caleb, their eyes now holding a different expression. Gone was the contempt or boredom. In its place was respect. They offered no words of thanks. Instead, Rosalia walked over to Caleb's desk. She used one of her sharp thorns to lightly slit her palm, leaving a small drop of blood. Caius did the same. One by one, the children followed, leaving small, bloody marks on Caleb's desk, forming an ancient symbol of dark loyalty. Caleb looked at the marks. He had faced death, entered the abyss, and fought to protect these monster children. He realized he was no longer a fugitive, a disgraced scholar. He was the Academy's blood vow proxy. For the first time in his life, Caleb Thorne felt a true purpose, even if that purpose was to protect a pack of monsters and accept death as a minor inconvenience. Silas's halting movement ceased entirely before the third door. The iron was ancient, scarred by symbols of binding, and sealed not with metal, but with faint, pulsating sigils of amethyst energy. The lock was a magical construct, humming with potent resistance. Caleb placed a nervous hand on the cold iron. "We can't brute force this, Pastor. It's an arcane binding. A protective ward, probably keyed to Lycaeus' bloodline." Silas responded with the deep, gravelly groan, a sound that spoke of eons of trapped agony. He raised his skeletal hand, the sharp piece of rib bone held like a grim stylus. He didn't try to pick the lock. He did something far stranger. He pressed the foul, decaying bone against the central, glowing sigil. The moment the necromantic material touched the pure arcane energy, there was a violent chemical reaction. The bone sizzled, releasing a puff of sickening decay that momentarily overwhelmed the smell of sulfur and magic. The violet sigil fractured silently, releasing a cloud of acrid purple smoke that smelled like burnt ozone and rot. Silas had used the negative, perpetually decaying energy of his own undeath to corrupt and bypass the protective ward. With another slow, agonizing scrape of his ruined joints, Silas nudged the door open. The air inside was thick enough to chew, a suffocating humidity that clung to Caleb's lungs. The chamber beyond was not a cell, but a vast, subterranean cavern, carved into a rough dome that ascended into darkness far above their light. In the center of the floor, the black ooze that had consumed the students was collected into a viscous, bubbling pool. It wasn't the thin stream they had seen upstairs. Here, it was the source, pulsing like a monstrous, dying heart. And the students were there. They weren't in the ooze. They were suspended within it. 6 forms floated listlessly, encased in transparent, semi-solid pockets of the dark fluid. They looked like grotesque insects trapped in amber. Their faces were pale, their bodies slack, their eyes closed but occasionally twitching. The ooze wasn't trying to kill them quickly. It was nurturing them, harvesting them. Thin, luminous black tendrils, almost like capillaries, branched out from the main pool and adhered to the student's skin, gently sucking. The Inheritors, Caleb breathed, horrified. They're being metabolized. He recognized the process immediately from the forgotten texts of necromantic assimilation. The Parasitic Beast was trying to integrate the Inheritors' inherent magical potency, their powerful bloodlines, into its own rapidly forming physical structure. It wasn't just killing them. It was trying to steal their essence to achieve full sentience and physical form. He glanced at the center of the pool. A central, massive bubble was forming, swelling and receding, coated in a thick, metallic sheen. It pulsated rhythmically, hinting at the beast's full emergence. They had very little time before the students were irreversibly metabolized, turning from victims into mere nutrient sludge for the creature. Caleb's mind, trained in analysis and crisis assessment, finally took over from sheer terror. Pastor, we need to sever those connections. We can't pull them out yet. The ooze will liquefy their contact points. Silas, standing rigidly at the entrance, tilted his head. His rumbled groan intensified. Then he pointed the sharpened rib bone towards the pool. He was ready to fight, but his slow, deliberate pace suggested he needed a plan of attack, not just a brute assault. Caleb scanned the chamber desperately, his eyes flicking over the pulsating black ooze, the damp cave walls, and the ethereal suspension of the students. He pulled out the blue tic-tac box again, realizing how truly futile his presence was. I'm a literary academic attempting an exorcism. Then he saw it. Scattered around the edges of the pool were fragments of what looked like petrified wood, strangely smooth and black. They radiated a faint coldness, a residual magical dampening effect. The wood, Caleb shouted, pointing. Pastor, those are petrified cypress shards. They're used in burial rites to ward off parasitic spirits. They disrupt the integrity of the black ooze. If we can throw them into the pool, we might destabilize its hold. Silas understood. He turned his attention from the students to the shards. He approached the closest fragment, his steps agonizingly slow, perhaps slowed by the oppressive magical atmosphere of the pool. He bent down, the movement causing a dry, tearing sound in his ancient vestments, and picked up a shard. It was long, heavy, and curved, perfectly suited for use as a weapon or a projectile. As Silas straightened, the pool responded. The central bubble violently burst, not with fluid, but with a sudden, piercing shriek of pure, dark energy. A rudimentary head, eyeless and gaping, formed rapidly from the viscous surface, tethered to the main mass by thick strands of ooze. The Parasitic Beast was aware of them. It didn't move immediately. Instead, the grotesque head fixed its attention on Caleb, the non-magical, terrified threat. A high-pitched, guttural sound tore from its nascent mouth, a sound that bypassed Caleb's ears and vibrated directly in his bones, bringing him to his knees. Silas, however, stood firm. The ancient, corrupted flesh of the pastor seemed immune to the beast's raw, sensory attack. Holding the cypress shard firmly, Silas let out a retaliatory noise, not a roar, but a deep, mournful wail that was heavy with the weight of centuries of undead servitude. The unspoken agreement was made. Silas would engage the immediate threat, and Caleb, the terrified scholar with nothing but wits, would gather the necessary weapons of salvation. Caleb scrambled towards the wall, desperate to grab the cypress shards. As he moved, the parasite beast lunged, sending a whip-like tendril of black ooze whipping through the air towards him. A split second before it connected, Silas intercepted. The undead pastor swung the petrified cypress shard like a heavy club, connecting with the ooze with a wet, cracking sound. The shard instantly absorbed some of the ooze's energy, glowing faintly, and the beast's tendril recoiled with a hiss, momentarily stunned. Distraction successful, Pastor, Caleb yelled, scooping up 3 heavy cypress fragments. He felt the cold, warding energy of the wood against his palms. This was it. The history professor was about to start throwing magical ammunition at a primordial entity from the abyss. Ready, Pastor. Silas turned, his eyes still milky but conveying deadly focus. He raised his rib-bone dagger and the cypress shard, a guardian of decomposition facing the hungry, nascent corruption. He was holding the line, a rotting bulwark against the darkness, giving Caleb the few precious seconds they needed to strike the heart of the black ooze and save the young inheritors. Caleb clutched the trembling oil lamp, its faint light barely enough to highlight the surrounding decay. They were descending deep into the solitary confinement dungeon, a spiraling labyrinth built not to contain bodies, but to lock away the strongest currents of energy and the most powerful spirits. Each of Caleb's heavy steps echoed on the worn stone stairs, a stark contrast to the near-absolute silence maintained by Pastor Silas. The air below was cold and thick, smelling of sulfur, damp rock, and something amorphous, like regret solidified into matter. The walls were not just stone. They were etched with countless rudimentary, yet terrifying binding symbols. Caleb recognized these markings not as curses, but as formulas designed to freeze time and pain. Silas, are you absolutely sure we shouldn't retreat a little? Caleb whispered, his voice strained with tension. Silas offered no reply. He simply moved. Though slow and limping, the pastor's body possessed a strange agility when navigating this infernal environment. As they passed through a narrow corridor, Caleb nearly stepped onto a loose flagstone. Instantly, a chain of scythe traps sprang into action, blunt but sharp steel blades whipping out from wall niches. They sliced through the space where Caleb's head should have been. Silas reacted immediately, not by fleeing, but by using his decomposing arm to block the last blade. The dry clack of metal hitting bone sounded, and Caleb could see a fresh fracture on the pastor's ulna. Silas withdrew his arm as if nothing had happened, then used a rotting finger to point at a tiny symbol hidden beneath the dust, an inscription Caleb recognized as the trap's deactivation mechanism. You know this place, Caleb concluded, feeling both grateful and horrified by his companion. Silas nodded, a slow, affirming movement. He was a part of this ruin, a living or dead encyclopedia of the Academy's dark architecture. They continued their descent, past subterranean levels designed to confuse spatial awareness and time itself. Some passages opened onto endless chasms, from which the faint moaning of trapped souls resonated. The journey finally led them to a vast junction where 5 dark corridors branched out like colossal ribs. Here, the concentration of dark fluid swirled so powerfully that Caleb's skin began to tingle and his hair stood on end. Perched at the center of the crossroad was a creature. It was a massive, mutant crow, larger than a dog, with glossy black feathers slicked with dark fluid. It sported several pairs of unusually wide, sickly yellow eyes and a beak so deformed it was nearly useless, yet it produced a grating, high-pitched screech. This creature was more than just a guard animal. It was an entity corrupted by magic, a collector of information and a predatory sentinel. It turned its head, its jaundiced eyes staring intently at Caleb, evaluating every point of his weakness. You smell too good, the crow rasped, its voice like a snapped piano wire. The smell of life and fresh fear. A trade. Silas raised his arm, preparing to engage, but Caleb stopped him. He understood. Mutated monsters were often driven by bizarre, unnatural, and novel desires. Caleb reached into his worn jacket pocket and pulled out a small blue box of Tic Tacs. The small, shiny container was utterly out of place in this subterranean hellscape. "Hello, friend," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice as steady as possible. "We are looking for the children, and an ugly monster that took them. Do you want this?" He opened the box. The cheerful clatter of the tiny, pristine mints contrasted sharply with the surrounding dead silence. The crow tilted its head, one of its auxiliary beaks tentatively extending. "Light," it hissed, trying to approach. "It is bright." Caleb shook the box. "It is. Bright and cool. All you have to do is tell me. Where did the monster take them? Where does the freshest blood smell strongest?" The crow hesitated, but the temptation of this alien, non-magical item was too great. It flapped its wings, scattering dust and shed feathers. "New blood. The suffering of the small masters," the crow whispered, pointing toward the third corridor. "Door number 3. Magic seeps from it like an open wound. He awaits the final absorption." Caleb threw the entire box of Tic Tacs toward it. The crow swooped down, tearing frenetically at the plastic container, ignoring both Silas and Caleb completely. Caleb and Silas moved swiftly, holding their breath. As they approached door number 3, the air changed abruptly. It was not only cold, but also felt searingly hot, as if black magic had been condensed to a near-combustible degree. The smell of fresh blood and the sickening stench of the parasitic beast was so overwhelming that Caleb gagged. The door was made of petrified vertebrae, sealed with rusty chains and sacrificial symbols inlaid with old rubies. Silas placed his rotting hand on the door. With a strength unimaginable for an undead man, he snapped the chains and shoved the door inward. Caleb stepped inside. The sight within slammed into his senses, nearly bringing him to his knees in horror. They were in a circular sacrificial chamber, hidden deep beneath the academy. The room was lit by flickering, pulsing green magical flames, illuminating several high, dark stone altars. On each altar, a student was bound by black, thorny magical vines. Thorn Girl was struggling to scream, her thorns blunted by the weight of the restraints. Tempest Boy was locked down, weak electrical sparks emitting from his body, yet insufficient to breach the magical shell encasing him. And in the center, upon a slab of dark red marble etched with ancient script, stood the Parasitic Beast. It had grown larger and more repulsive than when it attacked the classroom. Its body was now covered in chitinous armor and sharp-boned spurs, constantly swaying like toxic vegetation. Dark fluid oozed from its joints, forming bubbling puddles on the floor. But the most horrifying element was its action. The Parasitic Beast stood upright, facing the children. It extended one of its gigantic hands, and in the center of its palm, a massive, revolting mouth gaped wide. The mouth had no teeth, only a thick, dark purple tongue, vibrating as it suctioned the pure life force from the young masters. A weak, blue glow, like the very essence of the soul, was being pulled from the students' bodies and streamed directly into the monster's palm. If Caleb did not act immediately, the Bloodvow masters would be reduced to hollow husks. Caleb clenched the oil lamp, his body rigid between extreme fear and desperate fury. The goal was not just to rescue the children. The goal was to destroy the creature currently absorbing their living energy with its own horrifying hand. Without magical weapons, without supernatural powers, Caleb Thorne, the disgraced scholar, prepared to face the deepest devil of the Bloodvow Academy. Caleb Thorne was running on fumes and failure. An erstwhile scholar ruined by a penchant for bad investments and hounded by shadowy creditors. He viewed the substitute teaching position at the Hallowed Oath Academy as less a career move and more an elaborate, terrifying witness protection program. He drove past the forbidding gates, noting the macabre sight of petrified spines forming the archway, and shuddered. This ancient, cold Gothic fortress was his final resort. The interview with Headmaster Magnus Lycaeus took place in a cavernous chamber where the air itself seemed to possess a funerary chill. Magnus, a figure of daunting, hybrid beauty, part vampire aristocracy, part predatory wolf, did not ask about Caleb's curriculum vitae. His eyes, molten gold shot through with crimson flecks, seemed to peer directly into the raw, aching core of Caleb's desperation. Caleb was hired immediately, not for his competence, but for his expendability. He quickly realized the castle was a living labyrinth, always echoing with the muffled whispers of trapped spirits and the crackling sound of dark, ambient magic. His initial encounters with his faculty confirmed his dread. Professor Serafina was joyously dissecting a pulsing, heart-like object to quantify the exact weight of the soul, while Professor Fenris, a colossal, shaggy werewolf, offered the only cryptic piece of advice. Rule number 1. Guard the young masters at all costs. The tension built rapidly during Caleb's inaugural class. He attempted to lecture the monstrous student body, known collectively as the Inheritors, on the abstract history of political power, immediately facing the icy derision and ancient contempt radiating from the children born of primordial bloodlines. He struggled to maintain order against the quiet malice of Thorn Girl and the simmering volatility of Tempest Boy. As Caleb reached the climax of his prepared remarks, a profound, unnatural tremor shook the classroom. The marble floor beneath their feet fractured violently, opening with a sound like tearing silk. From the widening crack, a torrent of black bile, a viscous, unprocessed magical effluent, surged forth. A huge, amorphous creature, the Parasitic Beast, clawed its way out of the chasm. It possessed no discernible face, but sharp, osseous tentacles erupted from its back. Acting with lightning speed, the beast wrapped its bone limbs around Caleb's entire class, dragging the Inheritors screaming down into the magical abyss below, leaving Caleb stunned and reeling in the chaotic, steaming wreckage. The incident was immediately brought under control, not with compassion, but with cold fury. Headmaster Lycaeus materialized, expressing not worry, but intense anger over the unacceptable breach of protection protocols. He promptly forced Caleb to atone by undertaking the rescue himself, emphasizing that the Academy's prestige demanded the retrieval of its assets. Caleb was paired with Silas, the mute cleric, a reanimated corpse, silent and terrifying, smelling distinctly of decay and damp earth. Silas communicated only through agonizingly slow gestures and guttural moans heavy with centuries of compressed regret. Caleb, despite his profound revulsion for his partner, recognized Silas as his only hope. Their journey began immediately, descending into the solitary dungeons, a series of helical sublevels designed to neutralize and hold unstable magical entities. Caleb clutched his sole defensive gear, his intellect, and a fresh tin of blue peppermint Tic Tacs. The rescue operation swiftly deteriorated into a harrowing expedition into the Earth's maw, navigating spiraling cellars rigged with tripwires, scythe traps, and unsettling symbols of archaic sacrifice. Silas, though painfully slow, possessed an instinctual awareness that allowed him to bypass the magic-infused obstacles. Deep within the maze, they encountered a massive, mutated raven, a vicious genetic aberration guarding a critical junction. Using his final resort, Caleb strategically utilized the peppermint Tic Tacs to bribe the creature, exchanging the crisp mints for directions toward door number 3, the place where the concentration of dark magic and the stench of fresh blood were thickest. Prying open the heavy, creaking door, they stepped into a hidden sacrificial house, where the captive students were bound upon moss-covered stone plinths carved with ancient script. The Parasitic Beast was there, its spine covered in thorns, its huge, sickening maw open wide on its palm, preparing to drain the young Inheritors of their vital essence. As the heavy stone door groaned shut behind them, the air in the sacrificial house grew thick with sulfur and the metallic rust of fresh blood. The chamber was a dark, obsidian ring, centering on an altar where the students, the Inheritors, were tightly bound with glowing ropes of black frost magic. They were silent, offering no resistance, their eyes filled with cold disdain, as if awaiting a mistake in the ritual rather than a rescue. The parasite beast stood hulking over the circle, its body a mass of viscous flesh covered in protruding spines and bony spurs. Most horrifically, its face was absent from its normal position. Instead, a vast, grotesque maw full of jagged teeth opened wide on its right palm, emitting plumes of thick black bile. The monster was placing a bony claw upon Thorne Girl's head, ready to commence the power absorption process. Caleb, the box of peppermint Tic Tacs still heavy in his coat pocket, knew his academic brilliance was worthless here. "You," Caleb yelled, his voice thin and lost in the crypt. "You have made a grievous error. These children are not prey. They are property. And you, beast, are infringing on the Blood Oath clan's terms of ownership." He attempted to employ the same negotiation tactics he once used on his creditors, desperately turning a fight for survival into an administrative issue. The parasite beast tilted its head, earless but clearly hearing him. It ceased its absorption, and its dozens of black, vacant eyes, scattered across its chest, focused intently on Caleb. The monster responded with a dry, grinding roar, like tons of gravel being pulverized. It lashed out a tentacle toward Caleb. He dodged, but the creature's speed was far beyond his capacity. He was flung against the stone wall, his back slamming hard, causing his useless briefcase to fall. He felt a sharp, cracking pain in his ribs. "Silas!" "Now!" Caleb screamed. Silas, the mute cleric, who had remained frozen like a decaying monument, finally moved. His movements were slow, but deliberate. The parasite beast turned, drawn by the stench of ancient decomposition. It regarded Silas with curiosity, viewing the walking corpse as a potentially unappetizing snack, nothing more. Silas began to moan. It was not a sound of pain, but a deep, compressed sigh of millennia-old regret. With his putrefied hands, he slowly tore away his ancient shroud, revealing his rotting, empty chest cavity. He used the supernatural strength of the undead to snap off a piece of necrotized rib bone, the tip sharp and blackened like charcoal. In one horrific, determined instant, Silas lunged. The parasite beast laughed with the mouth on its palm, assuming the attack was pathetic. But Silas did not aim for the body. He aimed for the seat of its power. With a cold thwack, he plunged the sliver of rib, poisoned with the taint of decomposition and graveyard soil, into the parasite beast's supposed heart location. The parasite beast let out a shriek that was not of agony, but of pure magical disgust. The toxin of Silas's decay immediately clashed with the black bile surging through the creature, causing a catastrophic magical chemical reaction. The creature began to convulse, its bony tentacles thrashing wildly. This was Silas's chance. With one last look at Caleb, an expression of strangely satisfied finality, the mute cleric committed an act of absolute, glorious, and revolting self-sacrifice. He used all his remaining thrust, leaping directly into the gaping maw on the parasite beast's palm. The wet sound of putrid flesh meeting tooth and fleshy gum filled the chamber. The parasite beast was instantly internally compromised. The decay of the undead was not merely material, it was magical. The poison spread rapidly through its system, causing its massive body to seize and collapse onto the stone altar. The black bile churning in its gut began to boil, acidified by the death of Silas. Caleb, though horrified, acted instantly. He retrieved the letter opener he usually used for book deliveries, his actual weapon, and sprinted forward to free the children. He slashed through Thorne Girl's binding. She didn't blink, silently observing the spasmodic body of the beast. "Hurry," Caleb urged, his peppermint breath mixing with the stench of gore and sulfur. "We must go before it digests the cleric." Freeing the last child, Tempest Boy, who immediately summoned a chilling gust of air inside the crypt, Caleb led the charge out. The children did not need guidance. They were creatures of this abyss, and they knew the way. They scrambled back up the dizzying spiral of the solitary dungeons, tracking the lingering moans of the beast's prolonged agony. When they returned to the ruined classroom, where black bile still seeped from the floor, Headmaster Magnus Lycaeus was standing there, hands clasped behind his back, looking aloof and impeccable, as if waiting for a parent-teacher conference. Caleb gasped, exhausted, smeared with blood and damp earth. "They are safe," he reported, his voice cracking. "But Silas the cleric, he sacrificed himself." Magnus offered a thin, utterly warmthless smile, like frozen moonlight. "Sacrifice? No, Professor Thorne. Silas cannot sacrifice himself. His death is merely a process. As a reanimated corpse, he is simply seeking the most efficient method of regeneration. He required a powerful lure." Magnus nudged a large chunk of bony, fibrous meat near the black bile fissure with his toe. It was a severed tentacle from the Parasitic Beast. "And this is his reward," Magnus continued. "A pure source of magical nutrition. Millennia of decay made Silas's system sluggish. Now, he is having a much-needed snack." Just then, a sickening, wet sound echoed from the fissure. A black, rotting hand emerged from the black bile, gripping the massive chunk of tentacle. Silas the mute cleric reappeared, his undead face looking slightly plumper. He calmly began to peel the tentacle, savoring it slowly. Caleb realized Silas hadn't died. He had merely upgraded. "You see, Professor Thorne," Magnus said, his eyes glittering with savage delight. "At the Hallowed Oath Academy, only rule number 1 matters. And you have fulfilled it." He pulled out a pristine white handkerchief to dust his hands of the confrontation's grime, though he hadn't touched a thing. "You are no longer the substitute teacher. You are the scapegoat of the Blood Oath. Your job is not to teach them power, but to preserve them from those who would take their power, until they are strong enough to preserve themselves." Magnus vanished, leaving Caleb alone with the monster children. The students offered no words of thanks. Tempest Boy merely cocked his head. Thorn Girl approached Caleb's cracked desk. She made a small incision in her palm with a sharp claw, leaving